This week, we began our discussion of decision making in organizations, and we started with understanding individual decision making in organizations. First, just with what are the challenges people face in making decisions as individuals in organizations, and the challenges in organizations relate to the division of labor, which it causes people to be exposed to certain perspectives. So we have a variation in perspectives associated with division of labor and the impact of hierarchy of information coming through chains. And also organizational decision problems can be incredibly complicated problems. So questions of strategic acquisition and how do we integrate a new company into our existing company. Those are extremely difficult things to accomplish. They're not easy. It's 1,000 different decisions. And so what we see as organizations, as decision systems, have some kind of manifestations of how they do things that are different than the way individuals make decisions, and also the way that these kinds of decisions, individuals have a limited capacity to make them in their own right. So the notion is that our organization actually extends the capacity of individuals to make decisions. So the kind of base model, which in decision making is often a starting point, is the economic rational decision model. Certainly a great model. It's a normative model. It's how I try to make my financial decisions. Anything to do with investments, even some things like acquisition of personal property. You want to be rational. The bounded rational model says that people want to be rational, and in fact, they're trying to make the very best possible decisions. But certain types of decisions have a complexity of both the information necessary to make the decision, the time constraint associated with the decision limits our time to search for information. And we also are struggling with uncertain and incomplete information. In addition, we have a limited cognitive capacity. We can't think of everything in every iteration. And so what bounded rationality is it's a behavioral model that tries to describe and explain how people in the face of complex decisions make their decisions. And what they do is engage in a set of behaviors that are actually simplifying the decision problem. So they're trying to make the problem simpler. That's this notion of problem factoring. They're trying to search for information in the neighborhood of where the problem occurs. So, problem factoring and localized search we learn in math. We learn in debugging computer programs. So when we have a computer program that bombs on us, we're trained to go and say, where did it quit? Right? That's the localized search. It broke here. Let's start to look for a solution at this point. It may not be the right point, but it's a reasonable place to start. So that's this notion of localized search. In these complex situations, we typically engage in sequential search. We don't consider a lot of options simultaneously. We have to look at them one at a time. And mostly we're able to find reasonably good answers. We use satisficing, so the notion is in really complex situations, people try to find satisfactory solutions. And then, we're trained to, in business, in fact, find something satisfactory and engage in continuous improvement and improve it over time, right? It's even built into the notion of continuous improvement is this notion of we have satisfactory and over time we improve it. We also seek to have short run decisions with feedback. What we mean by that is we avoid commitment. So we try to make temporary decisions, get feedback, make adjustments to those decisions. And then also at the core is we have many problems we face over and over again, and so we adopt these standard solutions for standard problems. And it's in that standard solutions for standard problems that we really see the core of how bounded rationality is expressed at the organizational level. And the organizational level equivalent of this is what we call procedural rationality. And at its root, these deploying standard solutions for standard problem are the procedures that are at the core of bureaucracy. So what the procedural rational model does is describes an approach to decision making where we have procedural efficiency. People don't have to think through and make the decision every time. It accounts for the bounded rationality of the individual decision makers, and it has also really simplified kind of approaches to problem solving, one of which is we don't try and anticipate problems, we respond to problems. We engage in quasi-resolution of conflict, which means we solve problems incrementally. We don't deal with the big problem, we try and solve it locally without engaging the entire system. And then ultimately, the whole system is organized around standard operating procedures, which are kind of clusters of rules and decision-making activities. And many people don't think of bureaucracy as decision-making. It's really the fundamental baseline decision making that goes on in an organization. And it's a system that we oftentimes in a management role and in our leadership capacity are actually involved in creating. So the notion of bureaucracies are these systems of rules and procedures, and they have a logic to them, which is this logic of making the decision once and institutionalize it in rules and just doing it over and over again. So what we find is managers very often will, express dismay and dissatisfaction with the bureaucracy in their organization. But then when faced with a problem, what's their response? Let's make a rule. I mean, they're actually adding to it. I think it's extremely important that we have an awareness of this when we're in a leadership capacity. Because in leadership capacity, we're actually interested in not just constraining people's behavior, but liberating it, motivating it, encouraging people maybe not to be so bound by a kind of set of bureaucratic rules and procedures, which we said are people often retreat into. And part of that retreat into is what we call formalism, where they depersonalize their interaction. But also, this part of the retreat is this apathy inducing property rules where people will say, it's not my job. As soon as they say it's not my job, you're seeing the expression of apathy. And then also that people lose sight of the reason the rules were created in the first place. So the goals get lost, the rules become ends in their own right. And so all organizations have some level of bureaucracy. They vary in the degree to which the rules and regulations are the dominant logic. But all organizations have this, and really the question for us in our role as leaders is the appropriate level. Where do we start to use other kinds of mechanism? And then how this kind of background of how decisions work, how we navigate that and mobilize energy in the system. On the further reading, Herbert Simon is a Carnegie Mellon political scientist, social psychologist who wrote the book Administrative Behavior, which is the basis of his Nobel Prize winning research on bounded rationality. So, we may take this so for granted. It's hard to think that, well, gosh, this was somebody actually discovered this at some point, but it was Herb Simon, and he was the first non-economist to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. Also, Clayton Christensen, who is a local boy, grew up in Rose Park in Salt Lake City. He's a very well-known Harvard business professor. And his book, Innovator's Dilemma, is basically asks the question, why is it that people who dominate in a technology area oftentimes cease to have innovative capacity and get beat out by smaller companies, often advancing less good technology in the beginning, but that prevail in the long run. And really at the core of his argument is that organizations get ossified, they get kind of captured by their bureaucratic routine, they have a hard time, that the bureaucratic routines actually shape their perspective on the world. They have a hard time seeing new technologies that are emerging, maybe not even at a core, not as good, and they tend to dismiss them and be unresponsive. And so his very notion of the displacement of firms, the notion of ossification is very much this kind of cumulative effects of procedural rationality in the bureaucratic system. And the final thing that's mentioned there is Franz Kafka, the trial, very famous author, and the trial is about gentleman Joseph K., who is trapped in a bureaucratic quagmire, does not understand the situation in which he's in. He's put before trial with no kind of clarity. So it's kind of a fascinating book of a person trying to understand and navigate a situation which has its own logic of rules and regulations that are not apparent and are constantly a surprise. So I got to say, I can't recommend the book. It's one of the most difficult and boring reads I've ever had, but it's extremely famous, and it's very famous about for this exact problem it poses of, what is a person in modern life kind of gets trapped in an organizational logic that cannot be comprehended, and is almost is actually a victim of this enormous bureaucracy that has a logic of all of its own. And so you kind of see this theme emerge in movies and literature about the person as the victim of organization. And usually that's in reference to this machine-like quality of the bureaucracy that has its own logic and there's no intervention. And I think from our perspective, generally where we see the kind of pathological bureaucracy is what we're really looking at is an organization with no leadership, with no one to step forward to keep people focused on shared goals, to people focused on the service logic of the service organization. And so for us, this is very much a platform on which we're going to build on as we understand decision making in organization and understand where the leaders make a role and they add value to organizational processes.